The knife wasn't in Richard's hand yet, but the trap was already set, frozen solid and glistening under the porch light like a diamond-dusted grave. Elaine Carter didn't know that her husband of 20 years had priced her life down to the cent of a premium insurance payout, but the universe did. And that afternoon, in the mundane, flickering fluorescent hum of a Detroit mire, the universe sent a messenger in a tattered wool coat. The day had begun like any other in the Carter household, with a series of quiet, suffocating instructions. Richard had commented on the dust on the baseboards before leaving for his errands, his voice a calm, rhythmic drone that made Elaine feel like a failing employee rather than a wife. By 4 p.m., the Michigan sky had bruised into a deep, sickly purple, and the first pellets of sleet began to drum against the windshield of Elaine's aging sedan. She was tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't reach. At 57, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life, moving through the motions of grocery shopping to avoid the heavy silence of the house. She stood in line 4, clutching a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread, her mind drifting to the evening ahead. She would cook the pot roast exactly as Richard liked it. She would ensure the house was heated to his precise 71 degrees. She would exist in the periphery. The woman in front of her, however, shattered the trance. Ruth was a small woman, nearly swallowed by an oversized, moth-eaten coat that smelled of wood smoke and old cedar. She was digging frantically through a cracked leather purse, her gnarled hands shaking as she pulled out crumpled receipts and copper pennies. The cashier, a teenager with a name tag that read Tyler, tapped his fingers on the conveyor belt with practiced apathy. "I'm sorry, dear," Ruth whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I thought I had the 20. I must have left it by the kettle." The total was short by exactly $12.42. The line behind Elaine began to groan, a collective sigh of suburban impatience. Elaine looked at the back of Ruth's neck, seeing the way the woman's shoulders hunched in shame, and she felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. She knew that posture. It was the posture of someone who spent their life apologizing for taking up space. "I have it," Elaine said, stepping forward before she even realized she was moving. It wasn't about the money. It was a reflex of empathy. She swiped her card over the reader, effectively silencing the disgruntled man behind her. Ruth turned around slowly. Her face was a map of deep-etched sorrows, but her eyes were startlingly bright, a piercing, intelligent blue that seemed to look through Elaine's skin and directly at the bruises on her spirit. "You shouldn't have," Ruth said, though she didn't move to take her bags. "It's just a few groceries," Elaine replied with a tired smile. "The weather is getting bad. You should get home." As they walked toward the sliding glass doors, the bitter Michigan wind whipped against them, carrying the scent of impending ice. The automatic doors hissed open, and the freezing rain turned the world into a gray, blurred smear. Ruth stopped suddenly, her grip on Elaine's forearm tightening with a strength that felt impossible for a woman of her stature. It was a predatory, protective grip that forced Elaine to halt. "Listen to me, Elaine Carter," Ruth said. Elaine flinched. She hadn't introduced herself, and she wasn't wearing a name tag. Ruth's eyes, clouded by cataracts but sharp with an eerie, sudden clarity, locked onto hers. "Kindness is a beacon, but it draws the hungry things as much as the grateful ones. You have a kind soul, but you live in a house of shadows." "How do you?" Elaine started, but Ruth's voice rose, cutting through the wind. "The temperature is going to drop tonight. The sky will cry ice, and it will coat everything you own in a skin of glass. When the ice appears outside your house tonight, do not touch it, do not scrape it, do not try to clear the path." Elaine felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was a coldness that started in her marrow. It's just a storm. Ruth, my husband. He's very particular about the walkway. He'll want it cleared so no one slips. Ruth's expression hardened, her face becoming a mask of ancient stone. Control disguised as concern is still control. Child, he will tell you it is for your safety. He will tell you it is your duty. He will demand you break that ice. But hear me, the ice is a mirror. If you break the ice, you break the seal on your own life. If you go out there tonight with that steel in your hand, you will not come back inside. Elaine tried to pull her arm away, a nervous laugh escaping her throat. You're scaring me. It's just ice. It is a threshold, Ruth hissed, her breath a white plume in the freezing air. Do not touch the ice. Let the world stay frozen until the truth thaws out. Promise me. Elaine nodded reflexively, more to escape the woman's intense gaze than out of belief. Okay, I promise. Without another word, Ruth let go. She turned and walked into the swirling white chaos of the parking lot, her tattered coat billowing behind her like the wings of a dark bird. She didn't look back. Elaine stood frozen at the curb, the heavy plastic grocery bags cutting into her palms. She watched until the snow swallowed Ruth whole. She drove home in a trance, the windshield wipers rhythmic and hypnotic. Do not touch. Do not touch. Do not touch. As she pulled into the driveway of the pristine, silent colonial she shared with Richard, she saw him. He was standing at the living room window, a silhouette framed by the warm, deceptive glow of the lamps inside. He was watching the ice build up on the concrete. He was waiting. The interior of the house was a sanctuary of calculated order. As Elaine stepped through the door, the transition from the chaotic, freezing Michigan wind to the climate-controlled stillness of the hallway felt less like a homecoming and more like a surrender. The smell of lemon wax and expensive leather hung heavy in the air. Richard was a man of ritual. He believed that a man's home should be a reflection of his mastery over the world. You're nearly 20 minutes late, Elaine, Richard said, his voice drifting from the living room. He didn't shout. Richard never had to. His voice was a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards, a sound that always signaled the start of a subtle interrogation. Elaine set the groceries down on the quartz countertop, her hands still tingling from the cold and the ghost of Ruth's grip. The traffic was a nightmare, and the sleet is starting to stick. I had to go slow. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway. At 60, he was still a physically imposing man, kept fit by a rigid gym schedule and a diet he expected Elaine to manage perfectly. He adjusted his glasses and looked at her, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of a lie. And your coat is soaked. You should have been more prepared. A woman of your age can't afford to catch a chill. There it was. The concern. It was the velvet glove that hid the iron hand. He stepped closer, taking the milk from the bag and placing it in the refrigerator, his movements precise and geometric. The storm is worsening. I've been watching the Doppler. We're looking at a quarter-inch of ice within the hour. The walkway will be a death trap by morning. Elaine felt a pulse of adrenaline at the mention of the ice. Ruth's warning echoed in her ears. Control disguised as concern is still control. I'll put some salt down after I start the roast, Elaine offered, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Richard sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. Salt won't do it, Elaine. Not with this kind of accumulation. The salt will just sit on top and create a slush that freezes even harder. It needs to be scraped clean to the concrete while the rain is still falling, before the bond fully sets. It's the only way to ensure the path is safe. I'm exhausted. Richard, can't it wait until morning? We don't have to go out. Richard's expression shifted. The veneer of the doting husband didn't crack, but it thinned, revealing the predatory engine beneath. He walked to the mudroom and returned with the heavy steel-bladed scraper. The metal was cold and gray, the edge sharpened to a lethal point. He held it out to her. "I'd do it myself. Truly," he said, his voice dropping into a register of feigned regret. "But my lower back has been spasming since I moved those files this morning. I can barely stand straight. You know how it gets when the barometric pressure drops. I wouldn't ask if it weren't a matter of safety. If the mailman slips, or if you have to go out for an emergency. I couldn't live with myself knowing I let you walk onto a sheet of glass." Elaine looked at the scraper. It felt heavy, like a leaden weight designed to pull her down. She looked at Richard's back. The very back he claimed was spasming. He was standing perfectly straight, his posture as rigid as a soldier's. He wasn't in pain. He was directing a play. "Richard, it's pitch black out there," she pleaded. "And the wind is picking up. It's more dangerous for me to be out there scraping than it is to just leave it be." "Elaine," he said, his voice becoming dangerously soft. He stepped into her personal space. The scraper held between them like a barrier. "This isn't an argument. It's a necessity. I am trying to protect this house. I am trying to protect you. Why must you always make my concern for your well-being feel like a chore? Go out there, clear the path down to the stone, and then you can come back in for a warm dinner. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes if you work with purpose." The word purpose felt like a slap. Elaine took the scraper. The handle was cold through her gloves. She felt a wave of nausea. Ruth's words surged back. "If you break the ice, you break the seal on your own life." She walked to the back door, the mudroom light casting her shadow long and distorted across the floor. Richard stood in the kitchen, his arms crossed, watching her with a terrifyingly blank expectation. He didn't offer her a flashlight. He didn't offer to stand by the door and watch her. He simply waited for the sound of metal hitting ice. Elaine stepped out onto the porch. The world was transformed. The trees were encased in crystal, their branches groaning under the weight. The walkway was a shimmering black ribbon of treachery. The freezing rain stung her cheeks. Turning her breath into a frantic white mist, she walked to the edge of the steps and looked down. The ice was perfect. It was a pristine, undisturbed sheet of frozen water, reflecting the dim glow of the porch light. If she struck it, she would be breaking more than just the frozen rain. She would be breaking the only warning she had ever received from the universe. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, shivering in the dark. She lifted the scraper, her muscles tensing to strike the ground. But then, she stopped. She remembered the look in Ruth's eyes. The look of someone who knew exactly what happened to women who obeyed men like Richard until they vanished. Elaine didn't scrape. Instead, she stepped back into the shadows of the porch, out of the line of sight from the kitchen window. She stayed there in the freezing cold for 20 minutes, her teeth chattering, her body numb. She let the ice build up. She let the storm do its work. When she finally went back inside, she was shaking violently. She placed the scraper back in the mudroom, its blade dry and untouched by the stone. "It's done?" Richard asked, appearing in the hallway. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her boots, checking for the telltale signs of snow and ice. "It's too thick," Elaine lied, her voice a brittle whisper. "The scraper wouldn't catch. It's too much ice." "Richard, I couldn't get through it." For a second, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage flickered in Richard's eyes. A dark, jagged thing that he usually kept buried deep. He looked at the door, then back at his trembling wife. "I see," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "Well, I suppose we'll just have to see what the morning brings. Won't we? Go upstairs. Elaine, you're useless to me in this state." As she climbed the stairs, Elaine felt a strange, terrifying sense of liberation. She had disobeyed. She had kept the ice intact. And as she huddled under the blankets in the guest room, listening to the ice continue to thicken outside. She knew that the battle for her life had officially begun. The night was a long, suffocating expanse of silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic, metallic groaning of the house as the ice tightened its grip. Elaine did not go to their shared bedroom. Instead, she locked herself in the guest room at the far end of the hall, a space Richard rarely entered because he found the floral wallpaper distracting. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, staring at the window. Outside, the world was being buried in glass. Every few minutes, a loud crack would echo through the neighborhood, the sound of a tree limb finally surrendering to the weight of the ice and snapping like a bone. She listened for Richard. For hours, she heard his heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing the floorboards downstairs. He wasn't sleeping either. He was a man waiting for a clock to strike a specific hour. Around 2 a.m., she heard the unmistakable click of the back door's deadbolt. The sound was muffled, but in the pressurized silence of the house, it rang out like a gunshot. Elaine crept to the window, pulling the curtain back by a mere fraction of an inch. The backyard was a wasteland of silver and black. She couldn't see Richard, but she could see the glow of the motion sensor light over the garage flicker to life. A shadow moved, tall, broad, and slow. He was out there. She watched the silhouette of her husband standing on the porch, staring at the walkway she had refused to scrape. He stood perfectly still for 10 minutes, a dark sentinel in the freezing rain, before retreating back inside. Sleep eventually took her in fitful, terrifying bursts. She dreamt of Ruth standing in the middle of a frozen lake, pointing a gnarled finger at a reflection in the ice. In the dream, the reflection wasn't Elaine. It was a hollowed-out shell, a woman made of salt and ash. When the sun finally rose, it offered no warmth. The light was a pale, sickly gray that filtered through the ice-coated glass of the guest room window, distorting the world outside into a funhouse mirror. Elaine's joints ached from the cold that had seeped through the window frames. She stood up, her heart already racing, and walked to the window to face the morning. The backyard was beautiful in a lethal way. Every blade of grass was encased in a crystal sleeve, and the trees looked like elaborate glass sculptures. But as Elaine's eyes adjusted, the beauty vanished, replaced by a cold, crawling dread. The walkway she had refused to clear was a thick, jagged sheet of black ice. But it wasn't pristine anymore. There, etched into the crust of the frozen slush, were footprints. They didn't belong to Richard's heavy, size 12 work boots. These were smaller, narrower, the tread of a cheap sneaker. They didn't lead toward the street or the driveway. They originated from the dense thicket of hemlocks at the edge of the property, a blind spot where the neighbor's fence met theirs. The tracks told a story of predatory patience. They led from the trees to the edge of the walkway, circling the area where Elaine would have been standing had she obeyed Richard's command to scrape the ice. The footprints hovered there, deep and messy, indicating someone had been shifting their weight, waiting for hours in the dark. But the most terrifying discovery was directly beneath the guest room window. The ice there had been violently disturbed. Someone had stood there, right below where she had been sleeping. For a long time, the ice was hacked away in a jagged circle, and there were marks on the siding of the house. Faint, metallic scrapes that suggested a tool had been leaned against the wall. A heavy iron bar? A pipe? Elaine's breath hitched in her throat, fogging the glass. She realized with a jolt of pure electricity that if she had stepped onto that walkway last night, she wouldn't have just slipped. She would have been positioned perfectly, her back to the hemlocks, her head down, her movements slowed by the heavy scraper. For someone to step out of the shadows and finish what the ice started. Control disguised as concern, she whispered, her voice cracking. Richard hadn't been worried about her falling. He had been ensuring she was in the exact right place, at the exact right time, for an accident to occur. The ice was meant to be the alibi. A woman, nearly 60, slips in a historic ice storm, hits her head on the stone, and perishes in the cold while her husband sleeps soundly upstairs. It was a perfect, untraceable tragedy. She heard the floorboards creak in the hallway. Richard was awake. Elaine moved away from the window, her mind racing. She needed to look normal. She needed to act like the submissive, useless wife he thought she was. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath that felt like inhaling needles, and opened the door. Richard was standing at the top of the stairs, already dressed in a crisp flannel shirt and khakis. He looked refreshed, his face a mask of calm, suburban normalcy. "Morning, Elaine," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly pleasant. "I see the storm finally let up. It's a mess out there. I told you that ice would be a problem." "It is," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "It's much worse than I thought." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm going to head out to the hardware store. I need to get some heavy-duty melting crystals. Since you couldn't get the job done last night, I'll have to handle it myself before the mailman comes. Why don't you make some coffee? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I just didn't sleep well," she replied, forcing herself to walk past him. As she descended the stairs, she felt his eyes on the back of her neck. She knew he was looking at the footprints. She knew he was wondering why she wasn't dead. And most importantly, she knew she had to get out of this house before the accident found a second chance. The sound of Richard's car engine turning over in the driveway was the starting pistol for Elaine's survival. She stood at the kitchen window, hidden behind the lace curtains, watching the red taillights of his SUV disappear into the gray morning mist. She knew she had, at most, 45 minutes. Richard was a creature of habit. Even in a crisis, he would go to the specific hardware store 3 miles away because they honored his professional discount. Elaine didn't call the police immediately. A lifetime of being told she was dramatic and hysterical by the man who shared her bed had eroded her confidence. She needed proof. She needed to see the gears of the trap with her own eyes so she would never doubt her intuition again. She headed straight for the one room in the house she was strictly forbidden from entering. Richard's home office. It was a cold, windowless space tucked into the basement, reinforced with a heavy oak door that he kept locked with a keypad entry. He had told her it was for tax security, but Elaine had watched him type the code 1,000 times from the shadows of the hallway. 0612. Their wedding anniversary. The ultimate irony. The door clicked open, revealing a room that smelled of ozone and stale scotch. Unlike the rest of the house, which was curated for show, this room was a nerve center of clinical obsession. Elaine bypassed the mahogany desk and went straight for the filing cabinet. She expected to find bank statements or perhaps evidence of an affair. What she found was far more cold-blooded. In a folder labeled Property Management, she found a life insurance policy that had been updated less than a month ago. The payout was $500,000. But it was the riders attached to the policy that made the room spin. It included a double indemnity clause for accidental death occurring on the primary residence. If Elaine died from a fall on their property, Richard wouldn't just be a widower. He would be a millionaire. But the physical proof of the night's terrors lay in the trash bin beside the desk. Elaine pulled out several crumpled sheets of printed emails. As she smoothed them out on the desk, the horror of her reality crystallized. The emails were between Richard and a man named Marcus. Elaine recognized the name. Marcus had been a floor supervisor at the manufacturing plant Richard managed before his retirement. Marcus had been fired after a series of violent outbursts and a stint in a psychiatric facility. Richard had always spoken of him with a strange, paternal pity, claiming he was keeping tabs on the poor man. The emails told a different story. "The storm is the window," Richard had written 3 days ago. "The forecast is calling for a heavy freeze. She'll be out on the walkway at 9 p.m. She's small. Marcus. One good hit with the bar while she's struggling with the ice. And the fall will do the rest. The medical examiner won't look twice at a 57-year-old woman with a head injury on a night like this." Marcus's replies were frantic and desperate, filled with demands for money. "I need the first 10,000 tonight. Rich. I'm sitting in the van. It's freezing. If she doesn't come out soon, I'm coming in. Stay in the trees," Richard had replied at 9:30 p.m. The exact time Elaine had been standing on the porch, refusing to strike the ice. "She's being difficult. She's scared of the cold. Stay put. If she doesn't come out tonight, we'll move to Plan B. But the ice is the cleanest way." Elaine's hands shook so violently the papers rattled like dry leaves. "Plan B," she whispered. The realization that her life was a project to be managed, a problem to be solved through clean logistics, broke the last tether of her affection for the man she had loved for 2 decades. She reached for the office phone to call 911, but a sound from upstairs stopped her cold. The heavy thud of the mudroom door closing. Richard was back. He hadn't gone to the hardware store. Or if he had forgotten something. Elaine scrambled to put the papers back, but her coordination was gone. A sheet drifted to the floor, sliding under the heavy desk. She heard his footsteps, the slow, rhythmic thud of his boots on the kitchen tile directly above her head. Then, the footsteps stopped. She knew what he was doing. He was looking at the keypad. He was seeing that the security light was green instead of red. Elaine backed into the corner of the office, her heart thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked around for a weapon, her eyes landing on a heavy brass paperweight on the desk. She grabbed it, the cold metal biting into her palm. The basement stairs groaned. Richard was coming down. "Elaine?" His voice called out. It wasn't the voice of the concerned husband anymore. It was flat, toneless, and terrifyingly empty. "I know you're down here. You shouldn't be in my office. Elaine, we had an agreement about privacy." She stayed silent, pressing her back against the cold cinderblock wall. She watched the door. The shadow of his boots appeared in the gap at the bottom of the frame. "I saw the footprints. Elaine," he said through the door, his voice low and intimate. "I saw that you didn't scrape the ice. You've always been so stubborn. You think you're being clever. But all you're doing is making this more difficult for everyone. Marcus is very unhappy. He's been sitting in the van all night, and he wants his money." The door handle turned, slowly. "Open the door, Elaine. Let's talk about Plan B." In that moment, the unease that had governed her life for 20 years transformed into a white-hot spark of rage. She wasn't that useless woman he thought she was. She was the one who had listened to the universe. She was the one who had kept the seal on her life intact. And she wasn't going to let him break it now. The basement door creaked open, and for a moment, Richard stood framed in the yellow light of the hallway, a silhouette of domestic order gone wrong. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had misplaced his car keys. That was the most terrifying part. There was no foam at the mouth, no wild eyes. There was only the chilling, bureaucratic calm of a man who viewed his wife as an asset to be liquidated. "I found the emails, Richard," Elaine said. Her voice didn't shake. It was as cold and sharp as the ice outside. She held the brass paperweight at her side, her knuckles white. Richard stepped into the room, his eyes landing on the open filing cabinet and then moving to the desk. The mask didn't just slip. It evaporated. His face became a void of emotion. You were never supposed to be down here, Elaine. You were supposed to be a tragic headline in the morning paper. A slip, a fall, a grieving husband. It was a dignified end. This is messy. Messy? Elaine let out a hollow, jagged laugh. You tried to have me murdered for a payout. And you're worried about the aesthetics? Quote, I'm worried about my future, Richard snapped, his voice finally rising. He took a step toward her, his hands curling into fists. Do you have any idea what it's like to maintain this life? The mortgage, the taxes, the appearances? You haven't worked in 15 years. You're a drain on resources. Elaine, I've spent 2 decades managing you. And I'm tired. Marcus was supposed to be the solution. But you just couldn't do as you were told. You had to listen to that old hag at the store. Elaine's heart stopped. How do you know about her? Quote, I was in the parking lot, Richard hissed. I saw you talking to her. I saw her grab your arm. I knew she was putting ideas in your head. That's why I pushed you to go out last night. I knew if I didn't act fast, your intuition would get in the way. He lunged for her, his movements surprisingly fast for a man claiming a back injury. Elaine didn't freeze. The unease she had carried for years finally manifested as action. As he reached for her throat, she swung the brass paperweight with every ounce of repressed rage she possessed. It connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud, sending him stumbling back against the desk. She didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She bolted past him, her boots pounding on the basement stairs. She burst into the kitchen, lunging for her purse on the counter. But as she reached for the back door, a heavy shape blocked the glass. Marcus, the man from the footprints, was standing on the porch. He looked exactly as Elaine had imagined, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot, clutching a heavy tire iron. He tapped it against the glass, a slow, rhythmic sound that echoed the heartbeat of the storm. Elaine was trapped between the husband behind her and the hitman in front of her. But then, she remembered the ice. Marcus tried to step forward, to put his weight into a kick that would shatter the door. But he had been standing in the cold for too long, and he didn't know the terrain. He stepped onto the very sheet of black ice that Elaine had refused to scrape. The seal Ruth had told her not to break. She burst into the kitchen, lunging for her purse on the counter. But as she reached for the back door, a heavy shape blocked the glass. Marcus, the man from the footprints, was standing on the porch. He looked exactly as Elaine had imagined, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot, clutching a heavy tire iron. He tapped it against the glass, a slow, rhythmic sound that echoed the heartbeat of the storm. Elaine was trapped between the husband behind her and the hitman in front of her. But then, she remembered the ice. Marcus tried to step forward, to put his weight into a kick that would shatter the door. But he had been standing in the cold for too long, and he didn't know the terrain. He stepped onto the very sheet of black ice that Elaine had refused to scrape. The seal Ruth had told her not to break. She burst into the kitchen, lunging for her purse on the counter. But as she reached for the back door, a heavy shape blocked the glass. Marcus, the man from the footprints, was standing on the porch. He looked exactly as Elaine had imagined, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot, clutching a heavy tire iron. He tapped it against the glass, a slow, rhythmic sound that echoed the heartbeat of the storm. Elaine was trapped between the husband behind her and the hitman in front of her. But then, she remembered the ice. Marcus tried to step forward, to put his weight into a kick that would shatter the door. But he had been standing in the cold for too long, and he didn't know the terrain. He stepped onto the very sheet of black ice that Elaine had refused to scrape. The seal Ruth had told her not to break. His sneaker found no purchase. His legs flew out from under him with violent force. His head connected with the stone step with a sound like a melon dropping on pavement. The tire iron clattered away, sliding across the frozen driveway. Marcus lay still, his blood beginning to bloom like a dark, macabre flower in the white frost. Richard emerged from the basement, clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in a snarl. He saw Marcus down through the window and let out a strangled cry of frustration. "You useless." Quote. He never finished the sentence. The high-pitched wail of sirens cut through the morning air. Elaine hadn't called 911 from the office, but she had triggered the silent panic alarm Richard had installed by the back door years ago. A feature he'd bragged was for her protection. She had hit the button the moment she entered the kitchen. The police didn't find a grieving widower. They found a crime scene that told a perfect story. They found the emails under the desk, the updated insurance policy, and a half-conscious Marcus who, fearing for his own life, began to babble about Richard's promises of money before he was even in the ambulance. As the officers led Richard away in handcuffs, he didn't look at the body of his accomplice or the police cruisers. He looked at the ice on the walkway. He looked at the pristine, unscraped surface that had been his undoing. "It should have worked," he muttered. A broken man clinging to a failed plan. Elaine didn't watch him go. She walked to the edge of the driveway, where the sun was finally beginning to melt the edges of the storm. She looked at her hands. They were steady. The unease was gone, replaced by a vast, quiet clarity. Months later, Elaine sat in her new apartment, overlooking a park where children played in the spring grass. The furniture was minimal. The walls were bare of Richard's perfect art, and the air felt light. She had used a small portion of the settlement to buy a tattered wool coat, identical to the one Ruth had worn, and she kept it in the back of her closet as a relic. She never saw Ruth again, but she didn't need to. She understood now that the universe doesn't always speak in whispers. Sometimes, it speaks in the silence of a frozen night and the strength of a woman who finally learns to say no. Elaine Carter was 57 years old, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't being managed. She wasn't being protected. She was simply, gloriously, free. She walked to her door, checked the lock, not out of fear, but out of ownership, and stepped out into the sun. The ice had melted, and the world was hers to walk upon.